Okay, so we are on lab 7, appendicular division, articulations and movements. So I'm going to go through the document as usual first, and then we'll go through some of the images, or all the images actually. So now we're looking at the bones of the appendicular skeleton, which are all the bones of the arms and the legs and each side of the pelvis, right? And yeah, that's what it. We'll look at the scapula and each what's called os coxa, each side of your pelvis. Okay, so we're going to start at the upper extremities and work our way out. So we have the clavicle. The clavicle you just have to know as the clavicle. There are no other particular features to be identified on it that you're responsible for. Then we go to the scapula, and I don't ask you to distinguish between which one is the right one and the left one, but that you have identical images found on the right and on the left. So the bone is called the scapula. Then again, indented below that are some features that you would find on the scapula. So we have the first one, the glenoid fossa. So that's an indented region, kind of like where a saucer, where a cup and saucer would sit. So the saucer part indented, kind of concave. That functions as an articulation. It's nice and smooth. The head of the humerus sits in there. Then we have the acromion process that articulates with the clavicle. So we're going to call that articulation. You know, it's not like some muscles don't attach there, but the primary function of that acromion, and maybe we should just call it the acromion and not the acromion process, is that it forms a joint with the clavicle, the acromioclavicular joint. But there are some muscles that do attach there, but let's go with A for articulation. Now, the coracoid process that's found inferior to that, that doesn't articulate with anything. That is solely for a muscle attachment. All right, so the coracoid process is a muscle attachment. The spine of the scapula is also a muscle attachment. Okay, then we move on to the humerus. You have the head, which is the ball, the proximal end that looks kind of like a ball, or nice and smooth. All right. So the smooth head is articulation, A for articulation. And it's going to articulate with the glenoid fossa. Then in anatomical position, all right, you're going to have two bumps at the proximal end. You have the head, and then just distal to that, so to speak, you have a small bump that kind of points directly anterior, and a larger bump that points kind of out laterally from that point. That's called the lesser tubercle and the greater tubercle. Bumps, rough bumps on bone, or for muscle attachment. So M, greater tubercle, and lesser tubercle. All right, mid shaft and out laterally on the humerus is the deltoid tuberosity. Again, it's like a tubercle, roughened point of attachment. So M for muscle attachment. Then we have the distal end of the humerus. You have two areas of articulation. You have the capitulum, that is the more lateral aspect of the end of the bone, and the trochlea, which is toward the medial side. All right. Both of those are A for articulation, because at the capitulum, the head of the radius will articulate with it, and the trochlea, the ulna, articulates there. Then we wrap around to the medial aspect of the distal, excuse me, the distal humerus, and we have a medial epicondyle, which is a bump on bone. So because it's a bump, it functions as muscle attachment, M. On the distal posterior aspect of the humerus is the Olecranon Fossa, kind of like a glenoid fossa. It's going to be an indented region, and that's articulation also. It's nice and smooth. One part of the ulna is going to rotate into that, so it lets you extend your elbow completely. Okay, then we go on to the ulna. We have the Olecranon process, which is the attachment point, so that functions as a muscle attachment. You have the Olecranon, which is the whole thing, and the Olecranon process is the bump on the back. and that's where your triceps brachii muscle attaches to. Then you add the trochlear notch, which is a notch out region to the proximal end. That trochlear notch pivots around the trochlea of the humerus, nice and smooth, so it's A for articulation. Then the styloid process, the distal end of the bone, to both the radius and the ulna. You have these little tips, kind of pointy areas of that bone, and they're called the styloid process, on both of those bones actually. So on the ulna, it's just called the styloid process, and the radius has a styloid process as well. You don't have to know a function with that, just identify the structure. Okay, so then we go to the radius. You have a head of the radius, which is for articulation. You have a radial tuberosity, which is a bump on bone at the proximal end, but to the medial aspect. So the side of the radius that will come closest to the ulna, in the midpoint of the forearm. That's your radial tuberosity, and it acts as an M for muscle attachment. That's for the biceps brachii muscle. And then we have a styloid process too. So the distal tippy end of it is called a styloid process. In the wrists, we have styloid processes. In the ankles, we have malleoli, a medial and lateral malleolus. Okay, so now we've done the pectoral girdle. We have the humerus, the radius, the ulna. Now we just have the wrist and fingers. So the wrist bones, as a group, you just know them as carpals. You drive a car with your carpals. You walk on tar with your tarsus. Right. So the first 2 rows of 4 bones that are kind of squarish, those are your carpals. Then the bones distal to that point, if you make a fist, between those carpal bones and the long shafts of bone leading out to your big knuckle ridge and forming your big knuckle ridge, are your metacarpals. Any of the bones beyond your big knuckle ridge, when you make a fist, are your phalanges. You just know them as a group. Your thumb has only 2 phalanges, but every other finger has 3 phalanges. Okay, now we're going to move on to the lower appendages. So we have the pelvis, and you have a male and female pelvis. And each side of your pelvis is composed of 3 bones, or we call them, an os coxa or a coxal bone. We have an ilium, an ischium, and a pubis bone. Okay. So where you have, it says male / female pelvis, and then you have right / left coxal bones. This is what's found on those, the whole one side and the other, not necessarily associated with one particular bone. You have an acetabulum, which is an indentation, smooth surface that acts as an articulation. And the head of the femur fits in there. And so this forms like one of those ball and socket joints. So the acetabulum's function is A for articulation. It's a nice smooth area. Articulates how your femur is going to attach to your pelvis. The pubic symphysis is found anteriorly between the 2 pubic bones. That is an articulation. And then the obturator foramen, this is the first foramen we've had now in a while. So it's a hole. So it's P for passageway. All right, so let's go down. We're going to look at the 3 bones of the pelvis, the ilium, the ischium, the pubis bone. On the ilium, which is the largest portion of the side of your pelvis, it's about the upper 2/3 of the superior part, of your pelvis. That's your ilium. And on the posterior aspect, by your butt, by your sacrum, is this big scooped out region called the greater sciatic notch. All right, so this function, this notched region, is for the passageway of your big sciatic nerve. Your sciatic nerve is a big bundle of nerves from a few, not several, but a few lumbar vertebra and sacral nerves. And they form one big bundle, so they can go from your lower part of your back down into your legs, and it's going to pass through this greater sciatic notch. So it's the only notch that isn't a real foramen, a discrete hole that acts as a passageway. So P for passageway. Then we had the ischium, which is kind of your sitting bone. It's what you're sitting on right now. You rock back and forth. The bony part that you can feel kind of sticking out into the seat of your chair is your ischial tuberosity. It's a large, rough region. Tuberosity, like a tubercle. Right? So it functions as M for muscle attachment. Your hamstring muscles, as a group, they all originate from that point. Above that, between the ischial tuberosity and the greater sciatic notch, is a smaller, little sharper piece of bone that falls away. So it's a sharper, smaller little piece of bone, and that's your ischial spine, and that too functions as M for muscle attachment. Then you have the two pubis bones to the front. And, technically, I guess we could have put the pubic symphysis down below the pubis bone, because where the two pubis bones meet, it forms the pubis symphysis. But, either way, all right, the pubic symphysis is formed by the two pubis bones joining together on the anterior aspect of your pelvis, where you have fibrocartilage there, and that forms, an articulation. Okay, so now over to the right-hand side, we have the femur. Just a few things to find on the femur. Just like the humerus, we have a head of a femur. So that's the ball part, nice and smooth, functions as A for articulation. Then just like on the humerus, we said at the proximal end, we have a greater and lesser tubercle. On the femur, you're going to have trochanters because they're bigger. You're going to have a greater and a lesser. Now, when you're standing in anatomical position, if you're looking at a skeleton, the lesser trochanter is going to be found on the posterior aspect of the femur midline, and the greater trochanter is out laterally. And so they're reference surfaces, M for muscle attachment for both of those. The linea aspera is a raised ridge of bone on the posterior aspect of the femur, and that functions as M for muscle attachment. Below that is the patella, that's your kneecap. All you have to do is identify it as a patella. Maybe you'll get lucky and get that question. Below, below the knee joint is the tibia and the fibula. So the tibia is on the medial aspect, toward your inner thigh side of your lower extremity. It has 3 points of anatomy you have to identify. At the proximal end is a bumpy, rough, large reference surface called the tibial tuberosity. Functions as M for muscle attachment. And that's for your quadricep muscles as a group to insert. And we'll look at that more when we look at muscles. But the tibial tuberosity is just below your kneecap at the proximal end of your tibia. Roughened surface is for your quadriceps muscles to insert on. All right, then if you run your finger down the anterior aspect of the shaft of the tibia, you're going to feel another raised ridge of bone. And this is called the anterior crest. It's found on the anterior aspect of the tibia. And that too functions as M for muscle attachment. At the distal end of the tibia, on the medial aspect, is going to be a piece of bone that extends, and it's roughened, and it's called the medial malleolus. The medial malleolus and the lateral malleolus found on the fibula, which is the next bone, are larger, but synonymous with the styloid processes of the radius and the ulna. Right? But these are larger, so we call them malleoli instead of a styloid process. Right. So the medial malleolus is on the tibia. Right, then we have the fibula. I call it the Q-tip bone because, unless you have a really trained eye, both ends look the same. So it kind of looks like a Q-tip to me, just a very large one. So if someone points to that, shows you that bone, says, identify that bone, you would say it's the fibula. There's only one piece of anatomy to find on it, and it's going to be the end point, and that is the lateral malleolus. All right. So you either are going to answer fibula when you see fibula, or you're going to answer it's a lateral malleolus. Right? So these are the two parts that surround your ankle. You know, like if you flex your foot and you feel around your ankle, you can see that, feel those parts of the bone that stick, you know, kind of, I don't know, hard to explain, but form what you would think is the medial and lateral ankle that you might, you know, bump on a piece of furniture if you were walking through the living room at night. Those are your malleola. Medial malleolus on the tibia, lateral malleolus on the fibula. No function that you have to know. Okay, and just like in the hands, we're going to look at bones of the foot. We have the tarsal bones that, with the exception of the calcaneus and talus, you just have to know, you just know them as the group, as a group. When we look at the pictures of the talus and the calcaneus, you'll see how really large they are and how unique they appear. But the calcaneus is essentially your heel bone, and the talus is a bone that is superior to the calcaneus, and it's the tibia that will sit on top of the talus. So I would say the talus is on top and articulates with the tibia. Below that would be your heel bone, the big calcaneus. And then the other smaller squarish bones are just identified as a group as a tarsal bone. After that, you proceed a little distally from the foot, and you can feel the shafts of bone on the dorsal surface, or the top part of your foot is called the dorsal surface. And you can feel the long shafts of bone called the metatarsals there, the same way as you kind of palpated the top of your, you know, your hand when you made a fist. And they said, you know, when you can palpate those long shafts of bone that end up forming, you know, your big knuckle ridge, those are your metacarpals. But in your feet, the bones that are the shafts of bone that you can feel on the top of your foot, because there's not a lot of fat on the top of your foot, those are your metatarsals, and they terminate as the balls of your feet. Then anything beyond the balls of your toes are your phalanges, just like in the hands. You have two phalanges that form the big toe, and every other toe, including your little pinky toe, has three phalanges in them. Just know them as a group. The metatarsals as a group, phalanges as a group. Okay. So now we're going to move on to the classification of joints. And in lecture, we talked about that. We said that of all these different joints of your body, you can either classify them and identify each one, you know, as, you know, based on its functional classification or its structural classification. If you're talking about the functional classification, where you're asking an individual to say, how much movement can occur at this joint? And your three possible answers will be either synarthrotic, amphiarthrotic, or diarthrotic. Synarthrotic means like no movement at all. Amphiarthrotic means a little bit. And diarthrotic means a lot of movement. Okay, a lot of movement. So functional classification or terms is how much movement, describe how much movement occurs at that joint. If we're asking about the structural classification, then we're asking you what kind of tissue holds these two bones together. And therefore your possible answers to that would be either a fibrous joint, a cartilaginous joint, or a synovial joint, which is the most abundant. All right, so we're going to look at what are the fibrous joints. And then we go, okay, these are your three examples of fibrous joints. And then this is how we would functionally classify them. And then we're going to look at the cartilaginous joints, which are joints you've seen, you know, and referred to in lecture class. And then we'll look at the synovial joints and do the same thing. Okay, so remember, if it's a structural classification, what kind of tissue holds those two bones together? It's either a fibrous, cartilaginous, or a synovial joint. If we ask you about the functional classification of a particular joint by pointing to it, then we're asking you to either answer either synarthrotic, amphiarthrotic, diarthrotic. Synarthrotic being the least amount of movement, none. Amphiarthrotic, a little bit of movement. Diarthrotic, a lot of movement. Okay, so fibrous joints, sutures. Well, you know where sutures are located. We have a squamous suture, sagittal suture, lamdoidal suture. Okay, every suture, fibrous connective tissue, it very deeply holds them together. So a suture is an example of a fibrous joint. But let's just go ahead and classify it functionally at the same time. So you look at a suture and you go, okay, that's a fibrous joint. I know that. How much motion would I expect to occur there? Well, should you have any motion between the bones of your skull? I hope not. So you would answer synarthrotic. All right, so sutures are fibrous joints, and functionally, they are synarthrotic. Then we go to gomphosis. Gomphosis are your teeth sockets. Right? There's ligaments there, so it's a fibrous joint structurally. But what kind of motion would I expect to occur there? Well, none. Right? Your teeth shouldn't be moving in their sockets. So again, synarthrotic. The last fibrous joint you need to identify is a syndesmosis. Those interosseous membranes between the radius and the ulna. We said you have a radial-ulnar interosseous membrane, and then between the tibia and the fibula interosseous membrane. How much functional movement should be there? Amphiarthrotic. So there's a little bit of motion in that. Amphiarthrotic. So if you're not sure what a syndesmosis looks like, I think I have pictures up in the lab, and if not, I'll try to load them up maybe. Because in my lecture material, when we went through the appendicular skeleton, we were looking at these bones of the radius and the ulna. I said, look at that white connective tissue between them, that sheet of tissue holding those two bones close together and parallel to one another. So that is an interosseous membrane. That's going to come back up when we look at joint classifications. Okay, then we go to some cartilaginous joints. Synchondrosis. Well, an example of a synchondrosis are the epiphyseal plates. And now you go, okay, epiphyseal plate, I already know what tissue's there, right? It's hyaline cartilage. At an epiphyseal plate, we have endochondral ossification, where we find those 4 zones: zone of resting cartilage, zone of hypertrophy, resting cartilage, then proliferation, then zone of hypertrophy, and then a zone of calcification, ossification. All right, so now it's coming back. If you have blue stripe on a bone, little blue region. Right. So, yes, that epiphyseal plate is an example of a cartilaginous joint, but how much movement would I expect to occur there? Well, there should be none, right? So, that would be then synarthrotic. A symphysis, like a pubic symphysis and an intervertebral disc. Remember fibrocartilage locations. All right, so structurally, it's a cartilaginous joint. What tissue would I find there? Fibrocartilage. But what is the functional classification of those joints? Well, there's definitely some motion. It doesn't have a lot of motion, but it has some motion, so it's amphiarthrotic. Right, the rest of the synovial joints, be them a planar joint, a gliding joint, a hinge joint, a pivot joint, a condyloid, a ball and socket, they are all functionally classified as a diarthrotic joint. All synovial joints that are structurally classified are diarthrotically functionally classified, because synovial joints, given its composition, given its structure of articular ends of bone with synovial membranes and fluid in between, it parts by kind of definition, and the way they're built, it provides a high degree of motion. So anything that's a synovial joint structurally will be a diarthrotic functional classified joint. I'm not going to ask you if it's a ball and socket or a condyloid or a pivot or a hinge. Those are examples of synovial joints. All right, so if it's anything other than, let me just recap this. If it's anything other than a suture that you would recognize, a gomphosis, which is a tooth socket, I think you can find that. A syndesmosis, those interossei membranes, epiphyseal plates, intervertebral disc or pubic symphysis, then it must be a synovial joint. And it's functionally classified as diarthrotic. Okay, so then we're going to move on to the synovial joint model. We looked at that before, when we looked at the tissues, the skeletal tissue, where we said, hey, the blue ends is an example of a hyaline cartilage. As a structure, it's called the articular ends of bone. The tissue, quote unquote, you would find there is called hyaline cartilage. And then we looked at the pink grayish little pads between one bone and another. And we said those were menisci of the knee. Those were composed of fibrocartilage. So we're going to look at those same two structures in addition to the ligaments and the tendons we would find there. So on one side of the model, it's going to show you this green material. I think it's green. It's not highlighted red. That attaches bone to bone. Those are deep. They're called ligaments, and it's composed of fibrous connective tissue. And then where you see a tendon, which is, I believe it's going to be shaded in red, but we'll just confirm that when we get to the images. And it's cut, like you just see a blunt end of it. That represents a tendon. It's like you cut the muscle, so you only have the tendon left. And that functions as an attachment point. So the articular cartilage I provided for you functionally, as well as the synovial membrane and the synovial fluid, they function as shock absorbers and reduce friction. Both of them do. Ligaments attach bone to bone, right? It's the deepest level of joint support, and tendons attach muscle to bone. Okay, then we have motions of synovial and cartilaginous joints. And I think these are good to recognize what kind of motion might occur there. But we have flexion and extension. So flexion means decreasing the angle of a joint, and extension means increasing the angle of a joint. Think about just flexing your elbow and extending your elbow. Abduction versus adduction. ABA or abduction means move away from midline, kind of like raising your arms up to your sides, out to your sides, maybe all the way above your head. And adduction, like adding numbers together, returns your arms back to the medial point, brings them back toward midline. You can abduct and adduct your femurs too. You can swing your legs out to the side or bring them back together in the center. Pronation and supination are actions technically of your hands, right? So if you extend your arms out in front of you, palms up is supination, and just by rotating your wrist palms down, or really it's rotating your radius on your ulna, palms down would be pronation, palms up is supination. So palms up, think of like carrying a bowl of soup, supination, and palms down would be pronation. Then we have movement of the foot, dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So I know, how can you have two things that flex? Well, it's because you're taking it from a neutral position. So anatomical position, standing on your feet, okay? You can bring your toes closer toward your nose, which is called dorsiflexion. It's the dorsum part of your foot, the superior aspect of your foot becomes flexed toward your nose. That's dorsiflexion. Pointing your toes and rising up on your toes is called plantar flexion, because the undersurface of your foot is called the plantar surface. You have a lot of fat and musculature on the undersurface of your foot. All right, so toes to your nose, dorsiflexion. Pointing your toes, plantar flexion. Then we have elevation and depression. The best example of that is the hinge joint of the mandible at your temporal mandibular joint. The way your mandible moves, all right, and swings from that joint, all right, opening opening the mouth so you can put, a spoonful of soup or something in your mouth. Opening the mouth is called depression of the mandible. From the mouth being open, from an open position, returning it back to neutral, which would be closing the mouth or elevation of the mandible. Right? So opening the mouth is depression of the mandible, returning it, closing your mouth, your jaw, would be elevation of the mandible. Your scapula also elevates and depresses. When you raise your shoulders toward your ears, it slides your scapula essentially kind of slides along the surface of the backs of your ribs, and elevates and depresses as well. But the mandible, I think, is the easiest one to picture. Then you have rotation and circumduction. Example of rotation is the base of your thumb, right? Your metacarpal phalangeal joint, or the metacarpal carpal joint, I beg your pardon. At the base of your thumb joint, right, is a scooped out region where that metacarpal bone is going to sit in. And it allows you to rotate your thumb around in like 180 degrees. So lets it almost completely circumduct. So that's an example of rotation, and circumduction. Another example of rotation is C1 on C2, turning your head, looking right and left, or shaking your head no. And when you go from a supinated position to a pronated position with your arms extended out in front of you, if you do that with your right forearm and use your left forearm to feel what bones are moving, at your elbow, when you go from supination to pronation, your radius, stays, stationary, articulating with somewhat stationary with the humerus. It's going to pivot there and rotate so that the distal end of your radius actually rolls completely over onto your ulna. All right, so that's an example of rotation. The best ones are that radius, rotating and flipping over the ulna, as well as C1 on C2. Circumduction, an example of a circumduction movement with a lot of movement would be your shoulder joint, your glenohumeral joint between the glenoid fossa and your humerus. All right, your shoulder joint, you have a huge amount of motion there and circumduction and rotation within that joint. And your femur to your pelvis, what you think of as your hip joint, all right, is your femur can swing around, and you can make big circles. In addition to those joints, having circumduction, like the shoulders and the femurs, just like the thumb, you can have rotation in there as well. Because just by putting your arms out laterally, and let's say just extend your arms out to your sides, you can rotate the whole humerus, internal rotation, external rotation. You don't necessarily have to swing your whole arm around, but just rotating the head of humerus, in the glenoid fossa, that's actually rotation there as well as the femoral head and the acetabulum. So, okay, so that's it for these exercises. I generally, if I gave you a question about a type of synovial motion, it would probably be something very simple, like flexion and extension, maybe circumduction, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, because that's the foot, maybe elevation and depression in the mandible. It would be something I feel confident about that is fairly obvious. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share and switch to the images. So let's see if I can switch back to the images. Of course, I can't do that easily, so hold on. I'm going to close that out. I'm going to shrink this. I just have to pivot between the two and go now back to the course content to lab 7 and to our images. It always takes something like that. All right. Okay. reshare, and we should be cooking with oil now. Oops, there we go. Okay, just make that bigger. Let's hope. Yep, there it is. Yay. Okay, so I'll change my share. And now we're going to move on to images. So here we're on the first one. Identify the bone, the clavicle. Right, so that's pretty easy. You don't have to know any features on it. You just have to know it's a clavicle. Identify that bone, clavicle. You hope for a question like that. All right, then we move on to the scapula. All right, so we're looking at the posterior aspect of the scapula. You know, the part that would stick out posteriorly like a spinous process that you can, if you reach over and you palpate your scapula, you can feel for your scapula on the opposite side, you'll feel this raised ridge of bone that number 2 is pointing to. That's the spine. And you can follow it out to the tip of your shoulder, which becomes the acromion, or what we sometimes refer to as the acromion process. Then below the acromion process that sticks out anteriorly is the coracoid process. Coracoid process. Remember, the coronoid with an N, coronoid process is close to the nose on the mandible, but the coracoid process is found on the scapula. And then this indented region here, this kind of scooped out region like a saucer, right? That's your glenoid fossa or cavity. So this number 1, which is a glenoid fossa or cavity, functions as an articulation. 2, the spine of the scapula functions as a muscle attachment. 3, primarily that acromion functions as an articulation to form the acromioclavicular joint. Not that we can't find some muscles attaching to it, just like the vertebral bodies, of spine, but it's primarily articulation. And then the coracoid process is a muscle attachment. Okay, so we have scapula, glenoid fossa, spine, acromion process of the acromion, and the coracoid process, as we just described. Okay, then we have the bones of the humerus. All right, so we're going to start at the top, work our way out in the hands, and then go to the pelvis and work our way out. All right, we have the humerus, all right, first of all. Then we have the head here, which is what 1 is pointing to. Hopefully we'll get another point of view. It's the smooth surface, functions as articulation. And I said in anatomical position, the smaller, the lesser and greater trochanters, will be found at the proximal end. Pointing anteriorly will be the lesser tubercle. Did I say trochanter? I'm sorry, I meant lesser and greater tubercles. At the proximal end, in midline, is your lesser tubercle, and out laterally is a much larger bump called the greater tubercle. And again, if you get a chance to come to class, you'll get a better feeling of what those are, because then you actually see them and you can move the bone around and you'll just go, oh, okay, I get that. One's bigger and one's smaller. And they function as muscle attachments. Mid-shaft and out laterally, number 4 is the deltoid tuberosity. The only structure you can find that someone's going to ask you on a humerus, and right in the middle, along that diaphysis, is the deltoid tuberosity. And it's for a muscle attachment, namely the deltoid muscle. Okay, so that's not all the features to identify on there, but that's a few. So we'll go to the next card and we'll look at our handy answers. And lo and behold, 1 is the head. You have a lesser tubercle, a greater tubercle, and the deltoid tuberosity. All right. Smooth surface number 1, articulation, bump, bump, bump. 2, 3, and 4 are all muscle attachments. They're all bumps on bone. The only other thing you could possibly be asked on a humerus like this, that 4, it would be unfortunate to put the 4 right at that kind of spot, but let's say it was a little bit higher into the inside of it. And I said, identify this region of bone. If it's a region of bone, then it's the diaphysis. if it's a particular what is exactly it for that structure, then we're talking about, and at that location, mid shaft out laterally, it's a deltoid tuberosity. Okay, so we have the same bone. Here's the humerus, but now we're going to look at some features to the distal end. All right, so we have the two articular surfaces way at the ends, the tippy dippies. We have one, which is the lateral aspect of the humerus, at the elbow joint. And then we have number two, which is the medial side. It's kind of a hump, hollow, the hump region. And then three should be pointing to the concave region on the posterior aspect of the humerus. And I'm not sure why he never took a picture or pointed to the medial epicondyle. So I'm wondering if maybe it's in a subsequent picture. So the two smooth, even though they're bumps on bone, they're smooth, right? They're extensions of the bone, but they're smooth. So they form articulations, one with the radius and two with the ulna. So one is or two is the trochlea, one is the capitulum, and then we wrap around to the backside, the indented region, and that's the Olecranon Fossa. All right, so we have capitulum, trochlea, Olecranon Fossa on the back. Don't know why. I think he just forgot to point to it. But your medial epicondyle would be above two on the lateral aspect. See that knob of bone? That's the medial epicondyle. And it functions as a muscle attachment. All right, if we were looking directly at the posterior aspect, and we just turn the bone around, now you can see that scooped out region on the humerus, and that's the Olecranon Fossa. All right, so now we're going to move down into the forearm. This is a radius. I call it the mushroom cap bone because at the proximal end, it kind of looks like a mushroom cap, doesn't it? So we have the radius is the whole bone. One is pointing to the radial tuberosity. That bump kind of points and is next to the ulna. And then at the distal end, where number two is, that is the styloid process of the radius. Okay? So only two particular features you have to know. The radial tuberosity at the proximal end, that acts as a muscle attachment, biceps brachii muscle. And then the styloid process at the tippy end, you don't have to know a function. All right, so we have the radius is the bone, radial tuberosity, styloid process. Then we'll have the ulna. And to me, I call it the wrench bone because sideways, it kind of looks like a wrench. Or you can look at that scooped out region, kind of looks like a U, so U for ulna. The ulna is in anatomical position, it's on the medial aspect of the forearm. The radius is on the lateral aspect. Right? The ulna is on the pinky, PU ulna, medial side of the forearm. The radius is on the thumb side, lateral aspect of the forearm. Okay, so we are pointing to one is the Olecranon process. And here we have two is that notched out region. That's the trochlear notch. And then at the distal end, we have another styloid process. As I said, we have a styloid process on the radius, and we have a styloid process on the ulna. Okay, so the bone is the ulna. We have the Olecranon, and Olecranon process is the bumped region. So that's serves as a muscle attachment. Triceps brachii is going to attach to one. Right? The scooped out region called the trochlear notch functions as an articulation. A for articulation. It pivots around the trochlea of the humerus. like a hinge joint. And then you have the styloid process, the little tippy end of the bone, the distal end that's close to your wrist and your carpal bones. Okay, now we're going to look at hands. All right. The 2 rows of 4 little, really squarish but varying shapes, actually, of your wrist are called your carpal bones. That's number 1. Then you have your longer shafts of bone distal to that. 2 is pointing to the whole, it's actually sitting on a row of metacarpal bones and then kind of pointing to the metacarpal bone of your thumb. Those are your metacarpals. You know, and if you make a fist, then that contributes to and terminates at your big knuckle ridge. Anything beyond your big knuckle are going to be your phalanges, which is what 3 is sitting on. You have 3 in each finger except your thumb. Right, your thumb only has 2 phalanges. All right, so then we look at that. And we go, yep, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. Carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. Then we go to the pelvis, or each os coxa. So here, if we look at one side of your pelvis and the bone by itself, we call it an os coxa, or coxal bone. You have 3 bones that merge and fuse together to form this. We have to the anterior aspect, number 1 would be the pubis bone. To the posterior aspect, number 2 would be the ischium. And 3 would be the ilium. They all fuse together. If you could draw a Y in the middle of the acetabulum, which is the indented socket portion there that you're looking at, if you could draw a Y right through the center of that acetabulum and straight down through that foramen and all the way down to the bottom, that would show you the borders pretty much of the pubis bone to the front, the ischium to the back, and the ilium to the superior aspect. The pictures that show the 3 bones, the bones in different colors is the easiest way to identify that. Okay, so here, and we're looking at it from a different perspective, right? The whole side is called the coxal or the os coxa, right? Pubis, ischium, ilium. You turn the bone around. One side you're looking at the posterior aspect. Here you're looking at essentially the anterior aspect. All right, so that being said, you know, bone, bone, bone. Now we're going to start looking at some of these features. All right, so he's pointing to the bone here. It just says bone with an arrow. It would have been probably better if we just kind of put a number on it. But the bone, that would be the pubis bone, and it's pointing to the hole there, the obturator foramen. And all foramen function how? As a passageway, P for passageway. All right, so the bone is the pubic bone or the pubis bone. And that passageway, one is pointing to the hole, obturator foramen, and it functions as a P for passageway. Well, then we look at the back side of the bone. We have the ischial tuberosity at number 1 and the ischial spine. So the bone is the ischium or ischial bone, right? There are 2 features to identify. The big knobby region, number 1, is the ischial tuberosity. It functions as M, a muscle attachment. This is where all your hamstring muscles will originate from. Your biceps femoris, your semimembranosus, semitenogenosus. Then you have that little piece of bone superior to that. Looks like a little piece of, you know, like a sharper piece of bone extending posteriorly. That's your ischial spine. And that too functions as M for muscle attachment. All right. So you have the ischium bone or the ischial bone. Technically, it's an ischium. Ischial tuberosity, ischial spine. Muscle attachment, muscle attachment. Okay, then we have All right, now we're up on the ilium. And you know what I said before? I said that superior to, on the posterior aspect of the ilium and superior to that ischial spine is this scooped out region called the greater sciatic notch. It's a big notch. And again, you get a better understanding of it, or perception, a perception of what it really looks like and what its function would be when you see it in person or within a whole skeleton. You'll see this big notched out region, and that functions as a P for passageway for nerves. Right? So here you have the ilium. It's called the greater sciatic notch. I would try to point a little bit higher than that, but greater sciatic notch. P for passageway. All right, then we move to the femur. Right. The proximal end here. Look at that big smooth surface. That's the head of the femur. Functions as an articulation. It's smooth. It's going to sit in the acetabulum. Okay. Then we have we're looking at the posterior aspect. We said that, on the anterior aspect of the proximal humerus, we see the lesser tubercle and out laterally the greater tubercle. But it's opposite like that of on the femur in the lower extremity. So we have to look at the back toward your butt, the butt side of your femur, to see the lesser trochanter, because these are bigger bumps, so they're called trochanters. 3 would be the lesser trochanter, midline pointing out toward your butt. And the greater trochanter is a large pom-pom bone out laterally. Right. If you follow the raised ridge of bone below the lesser trochanter and run your finger down the diaphysis or shaft of the femur, you're going to feel this raised ridge of bone here, where number 4 is pointing to. And even it's number 4 is actually sitting on top of that whole raised ridge. That is the linea aspera. So you have the head of the humerus, articulation. Makes sense. It's soft, it's smooth. That's how smooth, and fits in the acetabulum. But your trochanters, the greater trochanter 2, the lesser trochanter 3, and the raised ridge of bone 4, the linea aspera, all those last 3, 2, 3, and 4, function as M for muscle attachment. M for muscle attachment. The only one that functions as articulation is number 1, the head. So we have the femur. 1 is the head of the femur, greater trochanter, lesser trochanter, linea aspera. See, now you get a little, you took a different picture. Now you can see a little bit more of what number 4 arrow is actually sitting on and what it's pointing to. You can see a little bit of a shadow there. You'll see it better if you can get into the lab. Okay, identify this bone. That is a patella. Patella. I hope you get that one because that's pretty easy. Largest sesamoid bone of the body. Then we had the bones below the knee. So I'm not sure why you couldn't get this rotated, but you're just going to have to look at it sideways. This is a tibia. All right. The proximal end is where number 1 is. The distal end is number 3. Right. So at that proximal end, this big, large bump on the bone, number 1 is pointing to, is the tibial tuberosity. Run your finger down the anterior diaphysis of that bone, and you can feel the anterior crest. And then at the distal end, number 3 is the medial malleolus. Number 1 and number 2, both the tibial tuberosity and the anterior crest, function as M for muscle attachment. And then 3, I'm not going to ask, you don't have to know. All right, it's the medial malleolus. Remember, the tibia sits on the medial aspect of the lower extremity, the fibula on the lateral aspect. All right. This bone here kind of looks the same at both ends. I mean, they're a little different, but that's what I call the Q-tip bone, and that's the fibula. All right. So the whole bone is the fibula. and this pointier end to it is the lateral malleolus, because the fibula is on the lateral aspect of the lower extremity. All right, so you got fibula, lateral malleolus. Then we move on to the bones of the foot. Oh, he got the tongue. Okay, he switched it around. My bad. We normally would go to the foot. Got a different version. So now the picture is turned right side up. The whole bone is the tibia, tibial tuberosity, anterior crest, medial malleolus. Okay, now we go to the foot. So now we're looking down from superior to inferior, down onto the foot. We have the bone on top that articulates with the tibia is that talus, TTT. So this is the smooth surface of it. It happens to be called the trochlea as well, but the bone that number 1 is pointed to is the talus, and the heel bone at number 2 is the calcaneus. Talus and calcaneus. Then we have distal to that point, the squarish little bones sitting in front of your talus and calcaneus as a group are known as the tarsal bones. They do have individual names, you just don't have to know them. They're like the carpal bones. Right, then we have these longer shafts of bone that terminate here at the distal end of them as the balls of your foot. Right, number 1 is sitting on top of them all. Those are the metatarsals. And then anything beyond the balls of your feet would all be phalanges. Again, the big toe has only 2, but every other toe, including your pinky toe, has 3 phalanges. Okay. So metatarsals and then the phalanges. All right, so again, he included some pictures from a lab book and textbook. You can use those to study from. Most of you, these days now, we use your phone. You can find all kinds of images. This is a helpful picture in case you don't have me for lecture. Do you see where you have a picture from a textbook? You have a humerus here, and then to the right-hand side is where you can see a radius and ulna together, and you see that white tissue found between those? That is the interossei that I was referring to. It's fibrous connective tissue that keeps those 2 bones kind of attached to one another, and keep them parallel with one another. That's interossei. That is a fibrous joint and is amphiarthrotic. So there's a little bit of motion. More pictures without the interosseous membrane. Some of those features found on those bones. Most of you have books. Here we have our carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, and the pelvis below that, or east side of the pelvis, called the os coxae, or the coxal bones. You can see ilium, ischium, and pubis bone. I think it's easier if you come to class and you see the colored ones. But, okay. This is just showing you the difference between a male and female pelvis. It's showing you on the upper portion some of the anatomy highlighted in yellow that you have to identify. But you can see the difference between a male and female pelvis. The easiest way is this pubic arch. The arch on the bottom here, that is very narrow in men, and look on the female side to the right inferior aspect. That angle is much broader and wider. That's a female pelvis. All right, looking at the tibia and the fibula and the femur from the left-hand side, we have the femur. See, there's a lot of other features on there you don't even have to know. We just want you to know the head, lesser and greater trochanters, and the linea aspera. Now you can see the tibia, the fibula, and that interosseous membrane, keeping them together. Look down below when you see, the anterior aspect of the femur and the tibia and the fibula. Here we see the bones of the foot. The talus is on top. You're looking straight down onto the foot. Right? So the talus is on top. Then we have the calcaneal bone to the back of your heel bone. The rest of those smaller little bones there that are between the talus of the calcaneus and the metatarsals, they're just as a group tarsals. You don't have to know the specific names. They have names, but you don't have to know them. So if I pointed to one of the little more square ones, it'd just be a tarsal. But if I point to the talus, I want talus. If I'm pointing to your heel bone, I want calcaneus. Distal to the tarsal bones are the longer shafts of bones, the metatarsals, and then that contribute to the balls of your feet. And then the bones distal to that point are all phalanges. Remember, the big toe and the thumb only have 2 phalanges. Every other digit, every other finger has 3 phalanges. Okay, so when it comes to joints and articulations, in addition to, I think the exercise in the lessons that you printed out that I just covered, or the first portion of the Zoom, is when you have them classified structurally as your fibrous joints, and then you just match up what the functional classification would be, and then your cartilaginous joints, what would their functional classifications be? I think that is probably simpler than this, but you can use either form. All right, so here we just have it in a chart form, where you have on the top legend, you have the functional classification, S, A, or D, synarthrotic, ampiarthrotic, or diarthrotic. Synarthrotic is no movement, ampiarthrotic is a little bit of movement, and diarthrotic is a lot of movement. And then on the vertical, we have the structural classification, fibrous going across, cartilaginous, and synovial. So you just find the meeting points to these. The sutures and the gomphoses are both fibrous joints out to the left, but functionally they're synarthrotic to the top. If we go over to the middle of fibrous, we have our syndesmoses, which is essentially our ligaments, and we have our interosseous membranes. We have syndesmoses, which are just ligaments in the body, or our interosseous membranes. They are fibrous structurally, but functionally they have a little bit of movement, so they're ampiarthrotic. No fibrous joints are diarthrotic or impart a lot of movement. Then we go to cartilaginous joints, the second row. An example is a synchondroses, which would be your epiphyseal plate. It's an example. And epiphyseal plates, how much function occurs there? None, or shouldn't be. So it's synarthrotic functionally. See how the junction of cartilage and synarthrotic come together, and that's where we find epiphyseal plate. Next to that would be your symphysis joints, your pubic symphysis and your intervertebral discs. They are cartilaginous, you know that because those are fibrocartilage locations. All right. So structurally they're cartilaginous, but functionally they're ampiarthrotic. And then lastly, of all the synovial joints, all synovial joints are diarthrotic. I'm not going to ask you, I might ask you something really easy like ball and socket joint maybe, or a hinge joint, something, but I even doubt that. There might be one or two. I created all these onlines last summer, and honestly, since then, I kind of forgot what I included and didn't include. I think I might ask just like those two. All right, so if you're a synovial joint, structurally, then functionally, you'll all be diarthrotic. Do you see how they kind of become mutually exclusive here and there? So either use the lesson the way we filled out that little section in the handout in the lessons for this week, or use this particular chart. Either one is fine. Okay, so that is it for the Zoom. I'm going to go ahead, clearly load it up. Try to watch it and view this, please, before Thursday. That way, if you have questions, you can ask them at the time. Not that you can't come the following week, and come to lab and ask questions there, or come to class and ask them. But, if you're fine staying at home and doing this, just, coming on campus every couple of weeks, that I'm fine with that too. All right. But if you have a question, the Thursday that we cover the lab is really the time to ask it. It's most efficient, because then I can demonstrate it in front of you. All right. And if you're good with looking at the Zoom, please, you need to at least log in at 3:30 on Thursday and just hang out for 5 minutes and leave. Do it on your phone or whatever you want to do, so I can include you in the attendance every week. This is very important, because just taking the quizzes does not constitute attendance, right? And we're getting to the second exam material, after exam after finishing that material after spring break. And if you're kind of tanking on that second exam, then we start to use the attendance as a kind of a measurement of that. And there's going to be the point where if you're not attending on a regular basis in class, that you can be withdrawn for non-attendance. So I will argue it to the dean that you were at least showing up to Zooms, and doing your quizzes in a timely manner. But just make everybody's life easier, especially mine and the dean's, is just jump into the Zoom, and attend for 5 minutes and then leave. I don't care, as long as once I finish doing that Zoom, it will give me a list of the people who attended. So, all right, I'm going to leave for now. I will see you Thursday. Bye.